In this video, we're going to talk about identifying dependent and independent variables. Our evidence for today, we're going to make sure that we know how to analyze a dependent variable. We're going to know how to analyze an independent variable. And then we're going to be using our math reasoning to understand the relationship between the two. That might come a little bit later, but we're going to start on it at least. We're also, of course, going to define what both of these things mean. So let's jump straight into that. What I'd like you to do is write down these two definitions. Our definition for an independent variable, think about where you've heard independent before. In this case, it's a little bit different because an independent variable is something that causes the dependent variable to change. The independent variable won't be impacted by any outside force. It'll just be whatever it is. A good example of an independent variable would be like time. Time is not going to be affected by anything, so it's independent. Dependent variables are variables that change in response to another variable. So based on an independent variable or perhaps a different dependent variable, they're going to change. So write both of these down. Pause the video if you need to, if we went through that too quickly. And then we'll move on to a helpful acronym in a sec here. Another way that you can think about this is with the acronym DRY mix. Each of these words, dry and mix, represents the independent and dependent variables, and it kind of tells you a little bit about what they are. So we'll start with the independent variable. The I here is what stands for independent, independent. I would also suggest taking this into your notes, by which I mean do it. The I stands for independent. The M stands for manipulated, because that is the thing that you get to choose. Manipulated. It's the thing that you get to choose. It's not going to change. You get to choose it, and then it affects the dependent variable. And the last part, the X, that stands for X. The variable that we usually use to show an independent variable is going to be X, so that's why it's here. As for the dependent variable, we have dry. D stands for dependent. R stands for responsive, because it is going to it is going to react, is going to respond to whatever your independent variable does. And finally, the Y stands for Y, because that is the most common variable that we use to talk about dependent variables. So remember, technically it should be like mix dry, because you have to have your independent variable first, but that's okay. Again, pause the video if you need to. Write it down so that you definitely have this, and then we'll continue to the next part. So in this example, we are going to figure out which variable is independent and which one is dependent. The scenario we have is Mr. H, that's me, buys a number of pizzas P. This costs me an amount of money M. So we have our two variables. We have P and we have M. We need to figure out which one is independent and which one is dependent. So this is a little bit of a logic puzzle. You have to think about both things. Which one do you get to choose? Which one is going to be based on your choice? In our case, we get to choose the number of pizzas. So P has to be our independent variable. And if you're just writing this down quickly for notes, you can abbreviate these as indep-var. That's totally fine. The amount of money we make, the amount of money it costs us, depends on the number of pizzas. So that means that M has to be the dependent variable. And it's always a good idea to check, does this depend on this? That'll help you check your work and make sure that you know which variable is which. So take a minute to copy this down. There's not a whole lot of notes on this slide, which is nice. write it down real quick, and then we'll continue on to the you do. In today's you do problem, you have a baker who used a certain number of cups of batter, B, to make a number of pancakes, P. Which variable do you think is the dependent variable? Make sure to explain your thinking. So you don't just get to write one variable is independent, the other one's dependent. Why did you choose the dependent variable? Explain why. It means you need to write at least a sentence. Pause the video so you can work on this now. So, things to remember. Independent variables cause a change to the dependent variable. The dependent variable changes in response to another variable. Finally, you can use the acronym DRYMIX to help you remember the difference between the two. If you need to go back into the video and remember what that actually stands for, you should have taken notes on that, but go ahead and scroll back or rewind and find it. Today's suggested practice problems. I realize you can't actually read number 7, so ignore number 7. You have 8 problems. It's the same thing that we did in the example and in the you do. You have 2 variables. You have to figure out which one's independent and which one's dependent. The nice thing is you don't have to explain these ones. Just make sure you understand why you chose the ones you did. I'd say pick 4 of them to do, whichever 4 you want to do, and that should be good. So that does it for this video. Hit like if you enjoyed it. Good luck.